Well, welcome everyone to the second keynote of UZAR 2022. I'm excited that we have so many people here, and I'm excited that we have the opportunity to hear from Amanda Cox today. Before we get to the keynote speech, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge one of our platinum sponsors, Absalon, who have prepared a message to share with UZAR. Amanda, would you allow me to share the screen?
You want me to stop sharing?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Yep.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. This is Pura from Absalon, and I am very excited to be here with you today. During this short session, I will share with you one of our recent initiatives related to Shiny Apps development. One of our core competencies at Absalon is building Shiny apps. We work a lot with Shiny, and we find this technology fascinating. It feels great to be able to work directly with end users and implement their ideas right away. This agility on top of our package's variety really makes Shiny unique and special. However, creating a real change is more than just speed and customer-driven development. You need to build something stable that can perform in the long term. It is a valid question if R and Shiny are production ready. Especially enterprise software requires high quality and reliability. Both R and Shiny are production ready, but as with other production ready technologies, you need to follow certain rules to succeed. Shiny as a framework has a unique set of strengths. We wanted to identify which Shiny advantages are the most important for the project success. We gathered learnings of what makes successful apps successful for many projects from the past that had an impact. And we made all this available publicly. We ended up with 6 key insights explaining what are the good practices and how to take care of quality. You can read about building something user wants, things like version control or CI/CD process, or building great user interfaces, and many other things. I invite you to go and check them all at shinymanifesto.com. Look at our findings, and if you like them, sign the manifesto with us. As a community, together, we can spread good practices and love for Shiny much further. And that's it. I wish you an amazing rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Thank you, Absalon, for your support. My name is Tom Stewart. I am a member of the organizing committee for UZAR 2022, and my day job is at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Amanda Cox in today's keynote. Before we get to the keynote, I just wanted to make a quick announcement that we are aware that the captioning feature of Excel Events platform is not working. We have received word from the Excel Events organizing team that the feature had to be disabled momentarily while they performed some maintenance. This outage is affecting all the Excel Events conferences, not just USAR, and they're working to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. Thankfully, that issue is not going to affect the keynote because we have contracted with a third-party provider to provide live human-generating captioning. If you are in a regular talk and you are experiencing some issues with the captioning, there is an alternative. You may use the live captioning option in Chrome, which many users have reported as being very effective. We're disappointed in this technical difficulty, but we are hopeful that Accelifence can resolve the issue quickly. Okay, allow me to introduce Amanda Cox is the head of special data projects at USA Fax. She was previously the data editor of the New York Times. She joined its graphics department in 2005, making charts and maps for the paper and its website. In 2016, she was named the editor of the Upshot section, which offers an analytical approach to the day's news. She is a leader in the field of data visualization. Before joining the Times, she worked at the Federal Reserve Board and earned a master's degree in statistics from the University of Washington. Without further delay, we'll turn the time over to Amanda Cox.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. Let me try to get my slides back. Good. So as you all know now, I spent a ton of my adult career at the Times making graphics, and I go out in the world and talk about work like this, which I'll show just a little bit of so we're on the same page. And so, this work was work that was done by a huge team. It's like 40 people, a bunch of different skills, people with a bunch of different kind of backgrounds. My own was in statistics, and, ours is the sort of language that I like to use. But so we go out in the world and give talks about this work. And almost always one of the questions at the end is what tools did you make? Like how do I make that? And what I would say was like, oh, it doesn't matter. You can do, like, the tools don't actually matter. And I've started to I'd say you can draw good graphics in the sidewalk with chalk. You can draw them with crayon on a napkin. It's really about the ideas and thinking about structure and thinking about the point that you want to make. The tools, like, they're not really that important. And in the last few months, I've started to wonder if I was just wrong on that, if I was just lying to people for a super long time. And there's a couple of the reasons of, right? Like, this is like me asking some of the new AI software, can you draw me statistical graphics on the sidewalk in chalk, like I was suggesting to people, and like, no, it has no idea what that means, and maybe it's too specific, and maybe it doesn't know what the term statistical graphics, but if I just add it's awful. But the real reason why is I've started this new job. I've joined a little nonprofit organization called USA Fax, and I spent a lot of the last few months hiring, and so I spent a lot of the last few months looking at portfolios of people who make graphics. And a game I play with myself is like, could you tell the tools that people are using? Like, in particular, I was looking for people who are maybe good with React, so React-based websites, web frameworks. And like, I feel like on average, the React portfolios are just a little less creative than other portfolios. And I've started to think a little bit more about like, how do the tools actually shape the thinking of the work, in particular some of the statistical visualization type work. And so from my time at the Times, that R was involved in making work that looks like R and doesn't look like R, to me at least. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Like, this is a graphic that I think of as something that like looks like R. I think there's something about how R structures data, and you think of it, that is like naturally conversant with small multiples. And you can make small multiples in a ton of different software, but the idea of I made it once, so now I'm going to make it again, it's super easy. I think very consistent with something like R. So this is a graphic to me that I feel like is looks like our graphic. It's also a decade old, and doing this a decade ago was a lot harder in a lot of other software. So this is a looks like our graphic. a couple weeks ago, my old colleagues published a graphic, and some new people there published a graphic that looks like this. And I don't think this one was even made in R at all. It's just about how Steph Curry is, so dominant in 3-pointers. But to me, this is still, I don't think it was actually made in R. I think it's straight to JavaScript probably, but it looks like an R graphic. And why does it look like an R graphic? And that's because it looks like other graphics that were inspired by R. This is the football version of the same thing, making some new choices. And I think it looks like R because this is the 20-year-old version of it that to me is the version that, and this is baseball, this is Bond's home runs instead of Curry 3-pointers, but it looks like R. There's a structure of this where you have more data than you actually need, but you're able to play with the hierarchy and play with the here's the one that stands out, or here's the one that's interesting, and you're working at a level that is not quite summary data. These are graphics to me that, whether or not they're actually made in R, they kind of look like R. And we've done, I often said that this sort of multi-line chart is kind of the theme of it, is that a lot of good songs have background singers, and so the lines in the back, they're not there to call attention to themselves, they're there to make the main guy look good. And so the sports all-star ones are clear illustrations of that, the lines pushed to the back, they're not there for noise, and they're not there to be in front, they're there to make the main guy look good. But we play with it in a lot of different ways. This is the unemployment rate, but instead of just plotting one line like we often do of the one unemployment line right here, we plotted hundreds of them for multiple combinations of demographic groups. So there's white women of a certain age group that look like me, and the unemployment rate was a lot lower at that time than the average. So you can kind of find yourself here. What's the effect of men versus women? I think of some of these exercises as poor man's regression. Some of this, these tab exercises. And then it's not so hard to click around in the chart and find a group where you have to change the axis altogether. And so this idea of, a bunch of lines, some in the background, some in the foreground, I think of this as kind of a looks like R-ish. Looks like R-ish graphic, but and that's in part because I know that the sketches for it came from R, the initial sketches. It looks like R to me. But when I talk about these in part, and there's different examples of it too. I think this is also a background singers example. This is how much do we think Medicare was going to cost over time, and as the projections play out, they flatten. And so this is an example where I think that context is super helpful. That if you only saw one line, you wouldn't have enough to interpret it. If you see them all together, even if you know nothing about Medicare, you can start to form opinions and start to think about forecasts a little bit better. So all kinds of versions of these multi-line graphics. One line is more important than the others. But when I talk about this and talk about context in the context of data visualization, I don't want that to be the chief lesson. So I sometimes talk about an example that's contrary to that. This is Damien Hurst, who at some points of time has been the most successful commercial artist in the world. And at one point there was a book coming out of his spot paintings, which are kind of the painting behind him. Before this book, it wasn't known how many of these spot paintings there were in the world, which I think is kind of fun, right? If you're just selling multi-million-dollar circles in a grid, it might be good for you to not know how many there are in the world. But, we have some data, and I think we could take kind of the classic approach to it. Here is we have a bunch of lines indexed to of artists of how much they're worth. Some ranking of their value. You have the guy you care about, Damien Hurst, and you have a bunch of maybe peers or you might want to compare him to, or people who are successful in their own peak, like an Andy Warhol or Gerhard Richter, or Jeff Koons. And so I think you could take the same approach to this as you take into some of the other graphics. You could say oh, I know the one I care about. I'll make the rest of the lines gray. Done. But Damien Hurst is a sort of artist who puts sharks in for. Really respect Damien Hurst with a line chart, and I think the answer is no. And so we started to think about what could we do with these spot paintings and knowing what they're worth. And so could we actually just show you and their size over time? And so if you bought a spot painting of colored circles in a grid for $3.5 million in the late just before 2010, you were probably underwater, right? Like it wasn't the best investment. And at this point, we couldn't get image rights to make a graphic like this. So I traced them, and like I think it's fun because I think a lot of my favorite data visualization takes advantage of the unique constraints of the data. The unique constraints of these paintings is that like they're trivial to trace. They're just circles in a grid, so you can like reproduce them super easy. If they were fine art, it would take a lot more. And so you can see, the little guitar or the skateboard, the charity versions, the versions of these things that we could afford. And so this is a graphic. To me, it doesn't look like R. I know it's R, but it doesn't look like R. And so let me give you a couple more examples of those graphics that are R but don't look like it, at least in part. Here's watch one of them.
Just how fast was Usain Bolt's gold medal sprint? Let's put him on a slightly bigger stage and see him race against every Olympic medalist since 1896. This imaginary race, assembled using runners' average speeds, reveals just how much faster sprinters have become. A few lanes over, we see another Usain Bolt, who dominated the field in Beijing in 2008. Almost 10 feet back, Carl Lewis, gold medalist in Seoul in 1988. He won in 1984 too, one of just a handful of sprinters on this track twice. As we go further back in time, we pass more of the fastest sprinters in history. Jim Hines, the first man to break 10 seconds in the Olympics. Jesse Owens, who won 4 golds in Berlin in 1936. Archie Hahn, the Milwaukee Meteor, who won 3 events in 1904. And finally, near the end of this track, we have Tom Burke, who won in Athens in 1896. His time, 12 seconds, puts him more than 60 feet behind today's winner. So what can we take away from this picture? For one, a lot of these sprinters are from the US. Although Americans have had a rivalry with British sprinters, and, more recently, Caribbean athletes, nearly half of these runners are Americans. But we can also see that glory is fleeting. Repeat performances are rare. There's been a new winner on the podium in all but 3 Olympics. But to get a little bit more perspective, let's see how some of America's best young sprinters would fit into this group. Here are the fastest kids at the 100-meter dash at different ages, as recorded by the Amateur Athletic Association. Obviously, they're way behind today's athletes, but they're not as far behind as you might expect. America's fastest 8-year-old did the 100-meter dash in 13 and a half seconds, which would have put him less than a second off 3rd place in 1896. Not bad for grade school. And the record for 15 to 16-year-olds is a 10.27. Good enough for a bronze as recently as 1980. Still, it's not like those Olympians were slow. Despite more than a century of improvements in nutrition, fitness, footwear, and track surfaces, the difference between today's athletes and the fastest humans of the 19th century? Just about 3 seconds.
And so the part of that little video that's made in R is the sound at the end. Is there a good reason for that? Like, no, not at all, other than that was how we knew to do it at the time and how we knew how to do it on deadline speed so that we could fill in new data after a race and news. At the beginning, we're playing around with like different types of sound of what could that look like. And so that is a very broken version of it. Like, this is an actual, not a good idea either. Like, now we know how to break it, and so we can just play with opera singers instead. At one point, I asked my colleague Graham, who is really good at 3D work, but also a musician, if he could just make a note for that, make something that would work in this little sound example. And he came back with a middle C, which I always think of as just brilliant about it's a lesson and how not to try so hard. So that video is something that I think I would never guess if I saw it as a stranger, that some part of it came out of R, but some part of it came out of R because it needed to, or because we knew how to do things in it. A different version of things that has come out of R some of our election night coverage in previous years, including this thing that's become known as the needle, which says like, what is our view is who is likely to win an election, and that basically comes from out of that this idea that is kind of weird that on news sites, the most traffic night of the year is election night, and you watch streams of data like this. This is a stream of results in Pennsylvania, I think, in 2020, and it's totally meaningless, right? Like this stream of just how the vote flows in over time, like it contains like very, very little information unless you bring your own geopolitical knowledge to it. And so like this is an artist in Michigan reacting to some of those time series, and I actually think it would be fun to just like display the pictures instead of the actual time series, because the time series means nothing. So right, like it would be so much better in the world if people just went and looked at the stars for that night, and then you wake up in the morning and you find out the answer. But we know we don't live in that world. And so we know with a little bit of statistical thinking, we can do better. The basic idea is someplace like this. Usually, if you just watch the raw vote returns, you're watching the map on the left there. Here's where votes have been counted in the middle of election night. But we know a lot more than that. Like we know, like based on population and voting histories and other things, like a rough idea of what might be left. Not the exact idea, so there'll be surprises. You don't know how many people voted usually. You don't know how they voted in particular, but you have a rough idea. So for example, in DC, there's these Democratic counties, or in Virginia, the Democratic counties along DC are often, almost every election in Virginia, they're the last ones to report. They're just super slow to count for whatever reason, and they lean very Democratic. So like if they haven't reported their votes yet, how there's the just what has been reported is going to shift, right? Because that there's these Democratic leaning areas that are left, and you can see that in like the idea is basically, can we make those lines that we were looking at the beginning as flat as possible, right? Like the wiggles are don't tell, like they're just results in some way, patterns of like how people voted or where they voted and how the vote was counted, but they don't actually contain the information that you want, right? And so in 2020, the new part of this, or the faster part, is like more and more places are putting precinct data live on the internet, which is great because often a precinct reports like much of its its vote in like one single drop, so that you can really get a sense of a place quite quickly. So precincts, pretty small places, a couple thousand votes usually. In Florida, type of vote. So, here's the votes that people voted actually on election day versus here's who voted early versus early in person, here's who voted by mail. And because of the polarization of those types of voting in the country, they had very different results expected out of them too, which is fine and great. So like, this is like awesome. Like in some ways, like, these are all the data that you would need to make those lines or estimates of those lines as flat as possible. That's the goal, to figure out from the very beginning, what does this actually mean? The question you care about is, what does it mean? The problem for us was we don't have any practice data, because we've never done this by precinct and type of vote reported before, and we didn't have any stored historically. But we did have some data stored over time of the totals, just not by type of vote, but just by the total. And then we know also how those totals have to break down by the end, because that's published, like how the mail vote voted, for example. And so you can think of that as like, that's like a system of linear equations. And so how can I solve it for practice data? Is like, I can accept that I don't need the exact answer, and I can use sort of the statistical tools that come out of R to generate practice data for us. And so this is some of the like most complicated code I've ever written, but code that I feel like I wouldn't have written if I didn't think in this way, that approximate answers were good enough, and not even good enough, but like could possibly be better than the exact answer. And that's, I think, is the sort of the ethos of the idea of the needle in general. The idea that if I'm willing to accept an approximate answer to the question you really care about, who will win, that's much better than accepting an exact answer to a question that you don't actually really care about, which is what votes have been counted right now. The other reason I threw some needle slides in here for this audience in particular is I wanted to say that like was good enough for production. The first times we started doing this, like the 2014 version, it wasn't an R. We like ceded to the sort of people who wanted to rewrite some of the models in JavaScript, and we didn't really deal with uncertainty properly at that point, or really at all. So it wasn't as big of a deal, and moved into that way. But as I've grown older, in particular, like in more of some of this experience is like recognizing that when you run into that resistance of running R things, like sometimes at least it's fake, right? Like that you're going to deal with like package management, like in whatever solution you choose. And so the resistance to R is not actually good resistance to R. It comes from a bad place. And so that, so there's where Florida ended, and here's our estimate, which is super flat over time. Figured out basically from the very beginning, as opposed to if you just watch the votes be counted, you're going on a journey. So, done in R, both generating practice data and maybe more interestingly, actually doing it, running models, complicated models with live data in production. So I'm a believer that like many things are possible in R, but I do think that some things are harder or less natural. So totally possible, but harder or less natural. I think of something like movement. And I think if we stay in elections land, also go way back, here's an example of that. This is exit poll data. Every box is how a state voted. So in this case, women more for Clinton, men more for Obama, Blacks people a lot more for Obama, white people more Clinton, young people a little more Obama, older Clinton, older still Clinton, even older more Clinton. But my favorite one was education. So that's no college versus some college grads, and then postgrads. And the reason I like it so much is that Arkansas box, that like that outlier, that postgrad, the idea of being postgrads in Arkansas, they're like friends of the Clintons, or like there's a reason that probably that box is an outlier. It's not just purely statistical noise. And I think of that box in some ways as the whole heart of data visualization, that box of like seeing things that like you could find it if you knew to expect it. If you just gave you a table of data and said like, what's the difference about postgraduate, where people with postgraduate education in Arkansas in this particular race, you could find the answer, but you wouldn't find it probably if I just handed you the tables by themselves, unless you're a really spectacular table reader. But the movement in this demonstration is super important, and what makes it elegant. And I know that the sketches for this thing didn't reflect that at all. Here's a different movement example. This is data on what Americans make in adulthood, their income, depending on how much money their family made when they were a child, when they were growing up. So it's broken into quintiles in this table here. But like, if you grow up poor, do you stay poor, or what are your chances of rising on the income ladder, essentially? And so tried to I found this data to be really fascinating, like the quantifying how sticky income is, and in the resolution of it was really great too. It came from tax data, so it covers 30 million Americans of a certain age, around my age. So the idea of the resolution of it was so big, so you could do really fine buckets, and we could try, sort of visualizations like this, where like here the, blue is more likely than pure chance, and yellow is less likely than pure chance, something like that. Try, this is R, this comes out of this is the same picture as the last one of like how do those, individual percentiles shift to a different percentile. Instead of color coding it, we try it with a height map instead. This is, I think, R hooked up to Plotly, just because that's a way I knew that like this diagram would come for free. And I think that's an interesting idea to think about in some of these, like how the tools shape your thinking, and that like it's becoming easier and easier to like just use all the tools. Like you don't have to choose. Still, here's a different example of the same data. Like let's try to not let's unfold it a little bit. Maybe we don't actually need it at the resolution that it comes from, because it comes from a 1 percentile break, so you don't actually need all of that data. but none of these really feel intuitive, right? Like you could work through all of these sketches and like I still have to like kind of explain them to you, and I bet you still don't actually really get it because they're hard. And it's unfair because there's not words on them and there's not proper legends and late captioning, but they feel a little hard and abstract. Talking about this and we say like, what are we really trying to show? We're trying to show like children climbing ladders. So talked about, should we just get a bunch of them in a gym? But that's going to be hard and involve lawyers and things like that. And so the answer instead was an approach that looked like this, where here all the yellow dots are white boys and the blue dots are black boys, all of whom grew up rich. So they all grew up in the top 20%, their family income. And then we track over time what happens to them. And so you can see the pattern, the blue are more likely to fall and the yellow, their wealth or their income, high income is more likely to be preserved. It's more protective for them, basically. The blue dots and like, basically evenly across the buckets. It's like they're basically evenly distributed across all 5 income buckets, and the yellow dots are much more concentrated at the top. But this is a sort of movement. One, I like it in this example because I think, again, it reflects what's unique about this data. What is unique about this data is that it's actually longitudinal. It follows people over a certain period of time. And so I like this form for it, even if it's totally inefficient. I think it captures a sense of what you're trying to do, and it maps to that mental model. But the movement still, there are people who can make this in art. I think there are not a lot of people who make things like this in art, and especially not a lot of people who make things like this in art as part of their sketching process, as part of like, before I know exactly what I'm trying to do and whether it will work, whether there's enough difference for it to be visually distinctive at all. I think this is still the sort of thing that generally doesn't come out of art. Another thing I think still, even though you can do it, tends to not come totally out of R, is something that I think of as true interaction. And so let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that sometimes. So the things we tend to call interactive on the web. I think in our crowd, you think like, oh, it's like shiny. And I think, those type of interactions often are like, oh, you can choose a drop bomb button, or you can roll over something and it will give you a pop-up. And I think of that in those sort of, or you can scroll down the page and it will do something like that. Or there's a search box where you can search for some predefined set of something that you want. And I think of that as like not true interaction. And I think by that definition, the physical newsprint is almost like more interactive than than some of the work that the Times is doing on its website. And I'll do a couple of quick examples of why I'm stating that a little bit provocatively. But there's the T magazine, which is sort of it's a special part of the New York Times. I have this kind of like art project thing where they said like, make tea something, and they did it with famous people. They said, here's your only items. You get a physical copy of the paper, and you get some other things too, and it's time boxed. You have an hour to do it. So this is Tom Dixon. I think he's a famous lighting designer. Here he's rolling his newspaper into something. He's building something. He's building a light. This is someone else who's famous in his own field. He's building a boat that's also a shirt. This guy's building a fan. This guy's making a protest sign. Then he's setting it on fire. And I think of these as like the physical newspaper is truly interactive. And I think of like as some of part of my definition of like what true interactivity means is like the possibility that you can do something stupid with it, right? Like, and if you do something stupid, like it will do something stupid back, right? Like it's not just like true interaction. I don't think is like you can roll over a box and I will give you some predefined content in that box. That's not truly interactive. It's personalized maybe a little bit in that like I can find out more details about the place I care about, but I can't see all the details together. But it's not like true interactive. And so closer to some of this work, if we think of that same data about like how much money do you make based on how much money your family made when you grew up. This is the same kind of idea, but instead of money on the y-axis, this is just a chance you go to college, not graduate from college, not a good college, just any college. And we told you that the median should go through this point. So, the median is 58% or something. And so, I would think it's probably sloping upward. And then at some point, once your parents make $300,000 a year or something, maybe it flattens out, and then maybe there's a little trust fund dip or something there at the end, right? Maybe something like that. And you could see how it compares to reality, and it gives you a little description about what you did. And the reason we did this in part is because I find the straightness of the truth stunning. I think it's really says something really important about class in America, that going from the 10th percentile to the 20th percentile changes your odds of going to college exactly the same as going from the the 95th to the 100th, almost exactly the same, right? In this line, it almost doesn't look like data, right? It's too straight. It looks like it comes from a regression output as opposed to just raw data. And it's too straight to be interesting. It doesn't look compelling enough, which is why we toss these ideas of maybe I take away and force you to throw down your expectations to then be surprised by it. But if I do something, kind of weird, right? It says did you even try? I don't think you did very well. And so there's this possibility. There's this possibility that it reacts to me in some way that is not total. These ways are predefined too, but that's sort of edging closer. And then our friends say, I'm pretty sure you just do jokey things, just drew the snake eating an elephant from the Little Prince, or this actually looks like the skyline from Frasier, and these are just jokes. You can't even you can't make these as a line plot. But I think of that sort of reaction as edging closer to what I think of as something closer to true interactivity. And I think that is still hard in R, even though R is the framework where you have that is useful for some of the closer to statistical thinking that you want to do to truly be interactive. Another thing that's totally possible to do in R, but I think just because there's some barriers for hardness, you don't see so often, is great annotation, or not so often, but as often as one should. So we are clear what we agree on that. The idea of annotation, I think, is often done much more clearer by some of my friends who make news graphics. And this is a Ukraine conflict many years ago, where it says here. Here's what a blockade looks like. These naval ships are maybe trying to prevent the Ukrainian ships from leaving port. And so if you look at this image, here are the Russian tugs, and here's the another Russian ship, right? So nothing super complicated, other than just putting labels on things, directly pointing to them, circling to them, saying here's the interesting part, here's what you want to actually look at in this image. There's a video, my colleagues who made these kind of sports videos about explaining aerial skiing. As an example that I really love so much. And there's a point that says he raises his arms, and we highlight arms. That's a helpful thing to do. And part of it is just for consistency. So it's more consistent with some of the other types of annotation, but it's actually really helpful in focusing, I think, even when it's so crazy simple. That's true for statistical graphics too, even when it's so crazy simple. This isn't a Times example. This is a David McCandless and Lee Byron older example about when people break up on Facebook, except I've cheated, and I've taken away their annotation layer. And in the annotation layer, there's nothing super complicated on here if you at least if you're American and you're sort of culturally familiar with when things happen, and yet it changes the graph. It makes it there's a April Fool's Day, and these patterns are Mondays, and there's some spring break patterns going on here, and so these holidays, they're not hard things, but say like I think they're super respectful to put draw the annotation on and leave it, because to say like, I'm probably going to spend more time with this data and be more educated about it and have more compelling ideas about it than your reader. And so the annotation layer just changes the experience of it entirely. Different example of that. This is a classic kind of unemployment jobs report day graphic. Jobs report comes out monthly in the United States, but and this one was the one before a presidential election. So we decided what would we do if we decided to try a little harder than normal. And so normally we give you just the straight charts. Here's the monthly change in jobs. Here's the unemployment rate. At this particular time, we gave you some blue goggles and some red goggles for how a Democrat might see things and how a Republican might see things. So you could put on your Democrat goggles and say, look, there have been 31 months of consecutive job growth. And the unemployment rate has fallen more than 2 percentage points since its recent peak. Or you could put on your Republican goggles and say, look, economy needs to add 150,000 jobs a month just to keep up with population growth. We're falling below that most months. And the unemployment rate has been above 8% for 43 months. And the reason I like this example so much in part is because all of those statements are true. Like, you don't have to lie, you don't have to spin the data, you don't have to argue about what it means. They're all true. All true together. And the annotation is not particularly hard either. It's deciding to draw a line on something, like a reference line like this one, or coloring some area, or just like pointing to things, like pointing to highlighting the trend that you want to highlight, or highlighting some part above some threshold, right? And so I think that this is like kind of advanced, it's sort of advanced trolling annotation, but this sort of annotation shapes all types of graphics. The fourth and last type of thing that I think that sometimes by our out of the box cannot be great at is some types of uncertainty. And that's a weird statement to make, right? Because it's great at some types of uncertainty. I think of it as great at this kind of uncertainty, sort of confidence band uncertainty. It's better than anything. This is one of my favorite all-time government charts. If we stay in jobs report land, this is a chart basically of how low can the unemployment rate be without causing inflation. That's one way to label it. It's also how equitable can the job market be before causing inflation is a different way to think about it. So it's like a super important measure. And I love this chart so much because of the footnote. And it says a 50% band is used because increasingly higher levels of confidence produce confidence bands that approach unboundedness. And I love the idea so much of the government footnote saying approaching unboundedness. I think it's super charming, but it's super important too, right? Like, if you read this chart without the uncertainty interval, it reads totally different. And then if you read it with the uncertainty interval, which means we have no idea anymore. This relationship is broken such that we have no idea what it means anymore, and how low the unemployment rate can be without causing sad side effects for other people. Right? If we go back to the other jobs chart, the jobs chart that we were just looking at, I think usually when we talk about uncertainty in this context, especially if we would talk about uncertainty out of R, you think of things like sticking confidence intervals on these numbers. And people do that with varying degrees of sophistication, like how well they respect the idea that it's a sample. These things are sampled, so there's some noise in it. And there's actually quite a bit of noise in the bar chart on the left. But I think it's a totally different type of uncertainty, that this sort of interpretive uncertainty about, but what does it actually mean, right? Is it not the same exact type of uncertainty as stick a confidence interval on the job chart? The interpretive, it's not unrelated to the confidence interval uncertainty, but I think that is there too. It's a different example of uncertainty that shaped some of my thinking about this. And this was an example before the last presidential election, where part of it came from, I felt that polls weren't capturing sort of the humanity of people. And so we thought, what is something that like everyone has and everyone could do that like you get a better picture of like them as a person. And so we said like almost everyone in America and close to everyone who would participate in a poll has a refrigerator. So we said, instead of answering like usual questions, in this case, like, could you just take a picture of your refrigerator for me? And then we turn it into a quiz that says like, can you guess whether this is a Trump, this refrigerator comes from a household that's voting for Trump or a household that's voting for Biden? And the mixed households, they're so small that we just threw them out. We just threw out their data. And so maybe that was, so sorry, I got that one wrong. Maybe this is a Biden fridge. It's not. It's a Trump fridge. Biden. So I'm 1 for 3 so far, and the beauty of it, at least to me, is that at some point the counters have been reset, but at some point we had like 25 million guesses, and it was also like our readers could accurately guess 52% of the time, and I find that like to be like such a beautiful answer about how like it's a game that's really hard, right? Like that you can't tell the difference, and you might be able to tell the difference, especially if you were given some answer. But there's a type of people in the world that can find appreciation and the beauty of how hard it is, that get the idea that it's just a coin flip. There's a certain type of people in the world who find the idea that there's a coin flip beautiful, and there's a certain type of people in the world who like I think can't understand that idea or don't understand that idea, or like just the way their mind works doesn't get that, like the idea that 50% actually says something kind of deep about this little silly exercise. Which reminds me that for all of this stuff, like the answer is that is personal, and that's how you use it. I think of, when Thomas Lynn Peterson makes art, he's using R in a way that like I cannot use R and wouldn't think to use R. When Thomas Morgenwald makes his like animations of like that's not a roller coaster. When he makes his animations of like roller coasters in R, he's making like using R in a way that like I do not think, or brain does not think, and it starts to feel like magic a little bit, right? And I think that's where you want to get, where the work starts to. I made a roller coaster movie once. That, see if you watch this, if you can guess why, I didn't make this in R, because like my brain does not think in that way in R, and I instead like use some roller coaster making software. This is actually polls in the 2016 election, and this was a version that was made in I think like October 2016 or something, and so it stops at some point. But I wouldn't, like R is so different to me, and so I think R can be different to a ton of people too. At one point, almost a decade ago, I scraped all of my old R code just to see what were the functions that I was using at the time. And today they would be different, but the exercise still holds, right? Like, so I call all my own functions F because I'm not a professional, right? And so and then really, like, I think the thing that you're doing is points and lines in text, and I think mastering that in whatever you're programming in, whatever the thing is the way that you get closer to true magic, is being the true master of points and lines in text, so that you can start to dream about stuff in the right way. So that's all I have to prepared for today, and I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has them. Or I can do them from the chat. I can read dies if you want me to.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. And we'll open it up for questions from the audience now. If you have a question, feel free to enter it into the Q&A box on your screen. And it looks like we actually already have a question for you. I'll go ahead and read it out loud here so that we have it in the recording. In one of your early examples, you showed an interface where you can find yourself based on your demographic. You looked for employed white woman as yourself. It would be interesting to find by pattern, regardless of demographic. That's a harder query, though. Demographic is easy, but it puts too much emphasis on our stereotypes. And probably there's a lot of variation within demographics, which gets lost. So I don't know if you have an initial reaction to that, this idea that perhaps focusing on the traditional demographics puts too much emphasis on possible stereotypes.
Yeah, for sure. I too am like kind of bored by traditional demographics in a way that like the breaking things down by race or age is not super compelling. There's a beautiful quote that I just struggled to find about like not wanting to do things that way and wanting to do things by like how people like butterflies or what their like most favorite painting is, like things like that. The graphic that I just pulled up about this decision tree, it's also super old. It's from the Obama Clinton primary again. I spent like a week collecting like all of the most exotic variables that I could find. Like in which once you limit those to like things that are collected at the county level, are not super variant. Anyway, but the idea of and I was so disappointed when like none of the exotic ones like rose to the top of my little tree. And so like, do I believe that there's a ton of variation that gets lost within demographics? 100%. I really believe firmly in the idea that like distributions are more interesting than averages. And so like the idea of like, can we like shift more towards like histogram type approaches when we can? So like I agree with the like sentiment of Dai's question like 100%, but also think that there are like the basic stuff captures a lot of the basic variation in mean that we see in the world, while we should also explore visualizations that preserve the full beauty of everything. So or like also sometimes split them into like super even finer groups, such that I forget what that one was called. Yeah, like so here, even if we're still using the same like basic boring demographic splits that are always available, the age, the race, the whatever, that here if we just like keep splitting them up and keep splitting them up and keep splitting them up, so like here here's by race, and then we do it by education, and then we do it by sex and age and state, and at some point in that like you're like covering like the whole field of everything, so that like there's enough. So that's a different approach to that. Like it's still the same stuff, but like if you just cut it fine enough, you still get a sense that there's like a ton of variation in things too.
Thank you. We have another question here from Dale Heumann, and I'll try to summarize this. He mentioned that many of your figures are dynamic, and he's curious to get your opinion on how things change if you're in a static environment, like a journal or a newspaper.
It's a good question. I feel like, I think it's also true in a sort of static environment. And I think like the annotation type stuff that I talked about, super easy to do in something like Illustrator, and super easy to do when you're only doing it once at some custom size, right? When you're making custom, like I know it's going to be 5.7 inches by 6 inches deep, so I know I have exactly the right amount of room for this. And so I think some of like the annotation brilliance has gotten like lost in that too, because it's like I'm making this thing for like from a smartphone to a desktop, and it's going to have to scale, and that's not going to scale super well. And so I do think it also is reflected in some of the like there also choices about the tools are also show up in the print versions, in the sense that like, I can tell a graph made in Excel from a graph made in Illustrator, and it's not about the quality of the typography, but I think sometimes it's about like the how difficult putting annotations is out of the box by default. Like, can you do it in any of them? Like, sure, but like, is there enough barriers in between that like maybe it's a little bit harder?
Interesting. We've got another question here about your section on uncertainty and displaying confidence intervals in graphs. The question here is, any tips on how to display confidence intervals on graphs intended for the general public? We often have a hard time defending their importance.
Yeah, so one of my tips that comes out of some of that work on the election night needle stuff, which became very, very most widely known in the 2016 election, which is an election that like a lot of people have a lot of feelings about, depending on what they hoped would happen for that night. So, it's associated with negative feelings for some people. And I won't claim that we did everything right that night either. But one of the lessons my colleague Gregor took out of that his quote was like, there's no soft display of uncertainty, right? Like there's and the way to think about that is like, you can't do like this sort of thing basically, right? Like you can't, and I think the gray there is the softness, right? Like you're trying to push it to the background. Like you're trying to say like, it's here if you want, but like, you don't have to look at it. And so, yeah, you're being like, if the uncertainty is what you really care about, like probably you should think about taking away the mean line, right? Because like, if you give me a mean line, I'm going to want the mean line. And so that is kind of a lesson that like, I don't want to admit is true, but I think probably is true. The idea there's no soft display of uncertainty, like stuff like this doesn't kind of work for at least when people are like confronted with a new problem and a problem that they actually care about. And I would say they say too, like, if you're speaking with a group of experts who all agrees on the same sort of thing, like do whatever you want, do what makes sense for you. But in the general case, I think if you want to care about the uncertainty, like you can't give me the mean and let me get attached to the mean and then like care about the uncertainty in the background. Like it just doesn't work that way.
So related to that, we have another question here. And that is we've had 2 years of pandemic. We've all been exposed to a lot of scientific and academic figures. And what are the things that you think that the scientific and academic figures can improve upon?
Yeah, my tip number 1 is use your verbs, like use your words and use a verb. And even the boring verbs like is count. So like the title of your charts, super crazy important. And so like instead of saying, graph of X, I think is often like a common like title, like just X is rising, X is flat, X shows a lot of variation, X something, right? So like find a way to get a verb into your title is my tip number 1 for academic work. And then tip number 2 is like don't try to do too much at once, right? Like and the other thing is I think you can, if you're an art person, I think maybe you in general the community is more likely to be math people, and so you can like recast a lot of like sort of the design advice about graphics as math problems if you want, and that if that makes you feel more powerful. So like directly label your lines, you can recast that as like minimize eye movement, and so now it's like an optimization problem that you like, maybe that's a world that you feel more comfortable in. But use a verb in the headline for your chart, and don't be afraid to use your words is my like number 1, like in the rank order, like by far that's my number 1 tip.
That's fantastic. Another question here from Lauren. I really appreciated your thoughts on true interaction. And I wonder if there was ever an idea for interaction that was ultimately too ambitious to execute. Kind of a story from the trenches, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things, and more it's like about not quite exactly knowing how to think about problems in the right way, or not even having the vocabulary to like to do it. And some of it's about ambition and like, so I don't think I have the perfect stories, but when you like there's things that are like still hard to like actually fathom about, like when we spent 3 minutes watching that Usain Bolt video, like, and you don't actually fathom like how fast it is compared to like if you could just run next to it for like 30 seconds, or things like that, like that would be like an actually like, and people have done that as like art exhibits, and I think there's even like AR versions of it where you can kind of do it, but I think we don't like, we have parts of the vocabulary and we have parts of the vocabulary for like, I think we use some of it every day. Like I'm convinced that like the best visualization in my own life is the like Google Maps map, right? Like, and like that is the one that I use most often. And like, it is like actually truly interactive. Like if I do something dumb, like it reacts to it in some, in some type of way. And so I think there's all kinds of ideas, and part of it is about user effort. Like the assumption, like at least from my world, is that you're not going to put a lot of effort into something unless the reward is there, right? Like, so even like that like line drawing example that I gave, like it's a little bit too hard actually for like, it's not going to go viral, but I still think it's a fun example. But that effort is not there. On the other hand, like you see with like, I think of examples of like closer to true interaction, like Josh Katz's sort of dialect quizzes, where we see like people answer like hundreds of questions as long as they're going to get like a personal map. So it's not, you can't say like, people will put in no effort, but there is something about effort that's super, like that makes some ideas not be realistic or feasible too.
Got it. Along with that, perhaps another story from the trenches. You used the phrase, and I think I heard it right, trolling annotation. Some annotation that brings the reader in. Any positive or negative experiences using that trolling annotation?
There's an example that I skipped. It's not. I don't. Trolling is probably the wrong word, and it's this talk is probably those. I feel like in that particular example is like it was the juxtaposition of the annotation that was the fun part, right? Like
Right.
right. It was the two side by side, like both together were very straight. They're very neutral. They're very like I'm indifferent. I think they were all true, but it was like a little bit pointed just in the sense of like, what does this mean? You can make it mean whatever you want it to mean, right? So like that's like the epistemological trolling was where the trolling kind of was there. But I think there's an example that I skipped in the annotation crew that like these are the sort of lines that we're looking at, both from that like drawing example or from the income example where the dots are falling, right? So the x-axis is like your parent household income rank, and the y-axis is something in life. And one of these is what's the chance that you were incarcerated on a given day, on census day, right? When the census, and so I do think that this chart becomes like a ton better when you say like, well, if you're a Black man and you were raised in the top 1%, which is like quite a bit of money. It's like $500,000 a year for like 5 years in a row. So like really raised like at least, and on average a lot more. You were raised in a quite wealthy household. Your chance of being incarcerated on census day in 2010 was about 2%, which is about the same as it was for the white men who were raised in families making $36,000 a year, like quite a bit less. I feel like that annotation, the like read this chart across, is a super, like, it's a helpful thing. It changes the graph. It like helps it makes a point. And you can react to that in annotation in a lot of different ways. And there's some people react to that annotation like, oh yeah, of course. And some things like, oh, of course, it's like an illustration of like a great societal problem. And so there's I think people, we concluded that it's personal. Like people bring a lot of like their personal priors onto like even relatively straightforward things too.
Yeah. One other question here. Obviously, newspapers track their analytics really well. They know how many people are reading each article. I'm curious if you've had an experience where you've put together a visualization that you thought was fantastic, but didn't translate in terms of the newspaper analytics.
Yeah, I don't know that I have like the perfect example, but like my own preference is always for things that are like slightly too complicated. But I do think that like everything should come like, or more things in life should come like on a like diving scoring system where it's like degree of difficulty adjusted, right? Like that, that like you can make like a popular map of like pop music trends, right? Like, and then like it's nothing about you being good, or also that it meets demand, right? Like there's like COVID content that like wasn't particularly good, but was like the questions that lots of people wanted answers and needed answers to in their lives. So it wasn't about like it being good. It was about like meeting a moment. And so there's like, there's all kinds of reasons where I think those might not match totally all together.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of our time together. I want to thank everybody for joining this keynote presentation with Amanda Cox, and want to thank her one more time for spending time with us today to talk about her work in data visualization. Thank you.
Thank
And with
you.
that, we'll be done.
Excellent. Thank you.